A judge chuckled upon hearing that 17-year-old Naomi was representing her cousin in court, but the entire courtroom fell silent by the time she concluded her statement. The courtroom held a subtle aroma of coffee and aged floor polish. Fluorescent lights hummed above as Naomi Ellison proceeded through the double doors, holding a substantial manila folder close. Her walk was determined, though it was evident she had practiced it before a mirror. Her thrift store slacks were a little too short, the white shirt just slightly wrinkled, and her bun, braided tight and pinned, had loosened a little in the Georgia humidity. Despite this, she kept her head high. 17 years old, not a lawyer, not even a college student, she was present to defend her cousin, and she wasn't planning on being dismissed. It was late morning in the Berrien County Courthouse in Nashville, Georgia, a modest building where everyone knew everyone. This was not a courtroom known for dramatic proceedings. It typically handled minor traffic offenses, small claims, and occasional custody disputes. Judge Byron Talcott had served on the bench for almost 3 decades. People in town remarked that he seemed from an earlier era, a diplomatic way of noting his resistance to change and his limited acceptance of it within his courtroom. As Naomi announced her role as Deshaun Little's legal representative, Judge Talcott peered over his glasses, appearing bewildered. "You're what now?" he inquired, looking down at the docket. "I'm representing my cousin in this case," Naomi stated, her voice unwavering. "I prepared a written argument, and—" He interrupted her. "You're not a lawyer," he said, a slight laugh escaping his lips. A ripple of laughter spread through the courtroom. It seemed impossible that she was young enough to drive, let alone practice law. Several individuals adjusted their positions to observe her more closely. A man seated in the rear even smiled, seemingly anticipating an amusing spectacle. Naomi remained composed. Her expression didn't change, and her hands were steady. She nodded once, opened her documents, and stated, with respect, "Your Honor, Georgia law permits individuals to represent others in non-criminal proceedings, provided both parties agree." Judge Talcott raised an eyebrow. "And you're telling me he consents to this?" Deshaun, seated beside her in jeans and a t-shirt, leaned toward the microphone. "Yes, sir, I do." A subtle change permeated the atmosphere. Naomi cleared her throat and added, "I'm prepared to proceed if the court is willing." The judge reclined in his chair, pausing for an extended moment. Then he smirked and waved his hand dismissively. "Fine. This will be interesting." The bailiff, an older man named Wiggins, inclined himself forward a little, focusing his gaze on Naomi with a hint of curiosity rather than disapproval. Naomi organized her documents with precision. She positioned her handwritten notes before her, turning to the page marked Opening Statement. Her script was precise, so precise that it seemed impossible anyone could have written it hastily. As she prepared to speak, a laugh escaped someone situated in the back of the room. The judge made no move to quiet it, nor did Naomi. She simply commenced. Before she could elaborate further, the judge interrupted her once more. "Miss Ellison, for the sake of argument, could you please state where you obtained your law degree?" She met his gaze steadily. "I do not possess one, but I have dedicated the past 2 years to studying Georgia traffic law, civil procedure, and judicial conduct during my leisure time. I've attended public hearings in 3 counties, transcribed trial footage, and reviewed over 50 court opinions. I do not possess a degree, but I am present to ensure the court's time is used productively." The room was silent now. Even the clerk had ceased typing. However, Judge Talcott still had one more maneuver prepared. Judge Talcott exhaled audibly through his nose, seemingly considering whether this was a misuse of time or an opportunity for spectacle. He shifted slightly in his chair and offered Naomi a brief, dismissive gesture. "Very well, Miss Ellison." Naomi remained unfazed. She delivered her introduction with the confidence of someone who had rehearsed it repeatedly. And she had. In her bedroom, she practiced, standing before a mirror with her backpack used as a makeshift podium. Her voice remained steady as she presented the details. Deshaun had been stopped by police for failing to stop at a stop sign outside the high school on a Saturday morning. There was no other traffic, and no pedestrians present. Despite this, the infraction resulted in a court summons and a significant financial penalty. Naomi's goal wasn't merely to dispute the fine. She aimed for its complete dismissal. In the second row, a white woman wearing a peach blazer spoke softly to the man beside her. He responded with a chuckle and a shake of his head. The clerk reclined in her chair, clicking her pen, anticipating Naomi's misstep. And Deshawn? He glanced at his hands, apprehensive, perhaps even a little irritated. "You sure you want to do this?" He had asked her that morning while they waited outside the courthouse. Naomi had answered without lifting her eyes from her notes. "I wouldn't be here if I wasn't." He remained silent after that. Now, seated beside her at the defendant's table, he fidgeted in his chair, seemingly wishing he could vanish. He was 17 as well, but Naomi made him feel even younger simply by being next to him. Naomi then addressed the matter of selective enforcement. The stop sign in question had been disregarded by numerous drivers that morning, including 2 local sheriff's deputies. Naomi possessed video footage captured by a neighbor, which was time-stamped and easily discernible. The footage displayed vehicles proceeding without interruption. There were no visible lights, no audible sirens, and no issued citations. She positioned a small USB drive on the table and raised her gaze toward the judge. "With the court's permission, I'd like to submit this as evidence." Judge Talcott remained still for a moment. Then, deliberately, he turned his attention to the bailiff. "Let's take a look." The screen activated. The courtroom's attention focused. The video consisted of straightforward street footage captured by a home security camera. Vehicle after vehicle passed the sign without pausing. Naomi allowed the recording to play for 20 seconds before stopping it and indicating a license plate belonging to a county sheriff. "I'm not suggesting that the law shouldn't be enforced," she stated, "only that it should be enforced fairly." There was no laughter this time. The judge, however, crossed his arms. "And you believe this demonstrates your cousin was treated unfairly?" Naomi replied concisely. "It demonstrates that enforcement lacks consistency. And when enforcement lacks consistency, citations can become subjective." He observed her intently for a moment. Naomi remained composed under his gaze. What the majority of individuals present didn't realize, couldn't possibly know, was her dedication over the previous 2 summers, secretly attending hearings in 3 counties. She documented proceedings with a well-used pen, quietly reciting legal terminology into a tape recorder obtained from her science teacher. No one had instructed her in these actions. Her high school lacked law electives, and internship opportunities for girls like her were scarce in Berrien County. Consequently, she pursued self-study. She dedicated late nights to reading legal blogs and case opinions while her mom worked double shifts at the nursing home. She prioritized this over socializing, foregoing parties and school dances. It was her chosen path. Now, upon her first opportunity to apply her knowledge, those present perceived her as a young person pretending. "I'll accept her." The judge cleared his throat. "We'll admit the video for review." "Continue." Naomi nodded and kept going, but the atmosphere hadn't changed yet. People still looked at her as if this would inevitably fail. But then Naomi said something that even made the court reporter lift her head. Naomi placed her palms flat on the table, leaned in just a little, and said, "This citation isn't just about a stop sign. It's about accountability. The question of whether authority figures, including officers, are held to the same standards as those they stop." That specific phrasing resonated powerfully. It didn't appear scripted, but its impact was undeniable. A noticeable silence fell over the room, unlike any that had come before. The murmuring ceased, and the expression softened. The clerk paused her pen-chewing habit. Even Judge Talcott reacted, seemingly surprised by her candid remark. Deshawn observed his cousin with a newfound perspective. He had always recognized her intelligence. Family members had expressed similar sentiments. However, this situation felt different. Naomi proceeded swiftly, turning to the subsequent page of her materials. Her notes were meticulously organized with a color-coded highlighting system. Blue indicated facts, green represented legal principles, and yellow marked quotes she had committed to memory. She began discussing Owens versus State of Georgia, a 1999 case concerning traffic enforcement and racial bias. She methodically reviewed the court's opinion, detailing it line by line, and clarified how the court recognized that unequal enforcement damaged public confidence. The judge intervened. "Ms. Ellison, are you drawing a comparison to the Owens case?" "That involved." She remained steady. "The relevant legal principles remain applicable, Your Honor. Selective enforcement compromises the fairness of any legal process, irrespective of whether it is criminal or civil." He reclined once more, his expression now neutral. The courtroom was fully engaged as well. The woman in the peach blazer now sat forward, resting her elbows on her knees, and intently listened. The man beside her put away his phone. Naomi proceeded. She presented traffic enforcement statistics from Willow Creek County, figures she had obtained via a Freedom of Information Act request and printed at the public library. The data revealed that 83% of traffic stops during the previous year involved black drivers, while census data indicated they comprised just under 40% of the population. She placed the documents before her. "I'm not suggesting anyone intentionally targeted my cousin," she stated. "The court is being asked to consider the established pattern. Ignoring patterns allows them to persist. This presentation is devoid of theatrics or raised voices. It is simply a recitation of facts and a quiet, direct assessment." Judge Talcott reviewed his notes, tapped his pen against the folder before him, then made a notation. The bailiff, Wiggins, folded his arms, not as an act of opposition, but in attentive listening. Deshawn murmured, "Yo, did you really obtain all those numbers?" Naomi murmured, her gaze fixed on the judge. "It took me 3 weeks." Deshawn blinked, surprised by the intensity of her statement. A cough echoed from a few rows behind. Yet no one chuckled. The judge remained silent, examining the printed documents before returning his attention to Naomi. "You've certainly done your homework, Miss Ellison," he observed. She offered a single nod, composed and prepared. Then, for the first time since she entered the courtroom, Naomi hesitated. The silence wasn't due to a lapse in her speech, but because she had arrived at the critical juncture of her argument. Her statement emphasized that the matter wasn't about achieving victory, it was about fairness. She affirmed that if the court found her cousin had indeed violated the law, they would abide by the decision. However, she insisted that if citations were to be issued in Cedar Creek County, they needed to carry consistent meaning regardless of the driver. This was the pivotal moment, not when she referenced legal precedent, nor when she presented the statistics. The sincerity of that statement seemed to resonate, and the judge closed his folder. "Let's take a 10-minute recess." Gasps weren't permitted in courtrooms, yet they were audible, noticeable in the subtle shifts of people and the murmured comment, "He never does that." During that brief pause, Naomi experienced her initial wave of genuine uncertainty. She sat on the unyielding wooden bench outside the courtroom, knees drawn close, hands tightly clasped around a bottle of water she hadn't opened. The braid at the nape of her neck was loosening, but she made no move to adjust it. She fixed her gaze straight ahead, seemingly observing something unseen by others. Deshawn sat next to her, his leg bouncing, his eyes darting frequently. "You good?" he eventually asked. She nodded, then murmured, "Yeah, but you don't seem it." A faint smile touched her lips. "I didn't come here to look good," he chuckled, then added more seriously, "Hey, thank you. For real. I didn't think you'd go that deep." She turned towards him. "You didn't think I meant it?" "I mean, I knew you were smart. I simply didn't realize you were this intelligent." Naomi did not respond. The courtroom door opened, and the bailiff motioned toward them. "Let's return to the matter at hand." Inside, the atmosphere had changed. The laughter from before had disappeared, yielding to a more subdued feeling. It wasn't quite respect. It wasn't quite admiration. It was simply focused attention. Judge Talcott observed Naomi when she re-entered. This time, he didn't squint or smirk. He continued to evaluate her. "Miss Ellison," he stated as she resumed her testimony, "let's hypothetically consider, just for a moment, that your assertion is valid. Could you please reference any specific wording in the law that would directly justify dismissing your cousin's citation? Naomi responded promptly. Yes, sir. Georgia Code, Section 40 to 620 details proper stop sign enforcement, but it also allows for interpretation regarding situations where enforcement might be applied unevenly or selectively. Moreover, the Equal Protection Clause, as defined in Yick Wo v. Hopkins, dictates that selective enforcement predicated on arbitrary distinctions compromises the law's legitimacy. The courtroom fell silent once more. The judge inclined himself forward, resting his elbows on his desk, observing her as if searching for a weakness. I notice you're quite well informed, he remarked. Yes, Your Honor. He then stated, his voice a little more pointed, that if she intended to cite Yick Wo, she should also be ready to discuss its relevance beyond licensing matters. She affirmed, explaining that the ruling's core principle extended beyond licenses. It concerned fairness under the law. The ruling explicitly stated that even seemingly neutral laws could not be applied in a discriminatory manner. For the first time, Judge Talcott refrained from interrupting, allowing her to complete her statement. He then folded his hands and looked directly at her. Miss Ellison, he said, speaking almost calmly now, what exactly do you want from this court? Naomi took a breath. I want my cousin's citation dismissed, and I want the court to acknowledge that enforcement patterns in this county deserve closer scrutiny. She didn't yell. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. The judge examined the documents before him, then surveyed the courtroom, and lastly turned his gaze to Naomi. Unexpectedly, he posed a question. May I review your notes? Naomi was taken aback. I'm sorry, he repeated. Your notes. It's evident you've invested significant effort. I'd appreciate the opportunity to examine them. The inquiry was unusual. Judges rarely made such requests. Naomi approached and presented the notes. Her hand briefly touched the bench, but she maintained her balance. The judge examined the pages, methodically, handwritten, color-coded, and arranged with the precision of a junior associate at a leading downtown Atlanta firm. This is remarkable, he stated after a prolonged pause. The courtroom remained silent. He then added, however, you must understand that argument isn't always sufficient in court. Sometimes, regardless of how just you are, the structure doesn't yield. Naomi did not avert her gaze. Then perhaps the structure requires pressure. The judge raised an eyebrow, but before he could respond, someone in the gallery stood. The woman who stood in the back row appeared to be in her 60s, with silver hair pulled back tightly and a black blouse buttoned to the neck. She seemed like someone who didn't speak unless it was important. Your Honor, she called out, her voice steady but quiet. Judge Talcott turned slowly. Ma'am, you need to sit down. This isn't open for public comment. But the woman did not flinch. I am Judith Minter. As a retired attorney with 41 years of experience in civil litigation, I feel compelled to state, for the record, that this young lady presented one of the most well-structured arguments I've observed in a courtroom, even among federal proceedings. While gasps weren't permitted, an audible intake of breath was clearly heard from half the gallery. Judge Talcott visibly stiffened but remained silent, simply observing Naomi. A fleeting, unreadable expression crossed his face. Frustration? Perhaps. Or something else entirely. He announced another recess. Naomi hurried outside. Her chest felt constricted, and her hands trembled slightly this time. Not from fear, but from the weight of everything. The room, the atmosphere, the abrupt quiet that followed the woman's statement. Deshawn followed her and sat next to her once more. You all right? He inquired. She hesitated before responding. Her fingers moved restlessly in her lap. Why would she say that? Naomi asked, almost to herself. Why would someone like her defend me? Deshawn shrugged, because she observed what everyone else had seen. Naomi allowed her shoulders to relax a little. Her entire body had been rigid for more than an hour, and she hadn't been aware of it. The courtroom doors opened again, and Naomi was surprised when Judith Minter emerged and approached her. Miss Ellison, she said softly as she sat down next to her on the bench. Do you understand the sort of bravery it requires to stand where you just stood? Particularly without the qualifications. That's not something that can be fabricated. Naomi began to speak, but Judith raised a hand. I'm not attempting to compliment you, she said. I'm stating a fact. And if you ever consider a career in law, I mean professionally, please contact me. I know individuals who would be fortunate to guide someone with your potential. Naomi paused, unsure how to respond. All she could say was, thank you. Judith smiled, then rose. Finish well. Don't allow him to manipulate you. He possesses more intelligence than he conveys, but he's likely to show you deference if you remain perceptive. Following that, the woman vanished down the hallway, her heels clicking softly against the tile. Deshawn turned to Naomi, a combination of awe and disbelief evident on his face. Yo, who are you right now? She offered a quiet, almost weary laugh. I'm just me. However, something in her demeanor had shifted. The anxiety was still present, but it no longer dominated. Not entirely. The bailiff entered the room. They're ready. Naomi stood, adjusted her shirt, and retrieved her folder. As she re-entered the courtroom, there were no whispers, no smirks, and Judge Talcott no longer leaned back as if dismissing her. Instead, he leaned forward. Naomi returned to the table, arranged her closing statement, and awaited approval. The judge offered a brief nod. Proceed. She took a final breath to compose herself, and then she began. The words she was about to speak would silence the entire courtroom. Naomi spoke calmly, no need for raised tones. My cousin is a teenager. He committed a minor error. But if the law isn't applied equally to all, young, old, black, white, officer, civilian, then it ceases to be law. It transforms into a suggestion, or, even more detrimentally, punishment for some and a caution for others. A stillness fell over the room. No one moved. Every gaze in that room was focused on her. Even the clerk, who had kept her fingers poised over the keyboard, was frozen midair. She continued, we've all heard that justice is blind, but it shouldn't be deaf. It shouldn't ignore patterns, or silence people who speak up about them. Naomi walked slowly to the evidence table, pulled up the citation, and held it out. This citation isn't just about a stop sign. It's about the choice to enforce, or not enforce, the law based on who's in the driver's seat. Her voice remained steady, almost calm, but her words carried significant weight. She addressed the judge. You inquired previously about what I sought from this court. I stated then that I desired the citation dismissed, and I maintain that desire. However, I also want recognition that fairness should not be something earned through appearances or background. It should be inherent, a given, for all. Judge Talcott looked down, tapping the citation folder again with the corner of his pen. He remained silent. Not yet. I may not hold a degree, Naomi stated, but I've gained knowledge observing courtrooms and opinions and law books over the past 2 years. I've learned that when justice functions correctly, it isn't felt as dominance. It feels like understanding, like recognition that you were listened to. Her voice faltered just a little at that final word, not enough to disrupt her flow, but enough to serve as a reminder to those present that she remained a teenager, still human, still someone who shouldn't have been required to prepare for this. She closed her folder and stepped back. Silence. A full 10 seconds elapsed before Judge Talcott finally exhaled. He adjusted his glasses, surveyed the courtroom, then focused his eyes on Naomi. I've been doing this for a long time, he said, long enough to recognize when someone enters this courtroom with something prepared, and when they enter with something authentic. He paused. You, Miss Ellison, you presented something authentic. Another pause. I am dismissing the citation. The issue isn't related to your cousin's connections, but rather the manner in which you presented this case. Furthermore, the evidence you offered prompted questions that this court cannot disregard. A murmur arose within the gallery, marked by surprise, quietness, and deference, yet he had not concluded. Judge Talcott moved forward, placing his hands on the desk. To be candid, I initially found amusement in your presentation, and that was an error. You didn't simply prepare, you informed this courtroom, and myself included. You maintained your position in a setting not intended for someone of your stature to speak with authority. And I believe this will not be the last instance. He tapped the gavel once. Not forcefully, simply to conclude proceedings. Court is adjourned. Naomi remained still initially. Deshawn observed her, as if she were an unfamiliar person. Or perhaps he was at long last perceiving the version of her that had always existed. Those present in the gallery did not immediately leave. Several approached her discreetly. The clerk even nodded once, murmuring, "Nice work, kid." Naomi held her folder close to her chest again. But now it didn't seem like a shield. It felt like a credential. As she and Deshawn walked out into the sun, he nudged her. "You're going to be on somebody's billboard one day." She laughed. "Not unless they catch me on a good hair day." He smiled wide. "Nah, I mean it. You changed something in there." Naomi looked ahead at the street, eyes squinting against the light. "I hope so." What followed would demonstrate that this instance marked merely the commencement of events. A week later, Naomi found herself once again in her bedroom, amidst piles of notebooks, scattered pens, and her aged school laptop adorned with discolored stickers. Her triumph at the courthouse had been reported in the local news. It wasn't extensive coverage, simply a few brief mentions in the Nashville Herald and a Facebook post from an individual who had been present in the gallery. However, the phone call that fundamentally altered the situation did not originate from a journalist. The call originated from the office of attorney Roland Brewster, located in Macon. She nearly ignored it, as the phone number was unknown and her mom had cautioned her against answering unrecognized calls. However, an intuition prompted her to answer. "Is this Naomi Ellison?" A voice inquired. "Yes," she replied. "This is Angela from the office of Roland Brewster. He would like to speak with you, if you're available." Naomi straightened on the bed. Certainly?" A click was heard. A man's voice then spoke, warm yet straightforward. "Naomi, my name is Roland. I've been practicing law in Georgia for 27 years. A colleague of mine, Judith Minter, sent me a copy of your court presentation. She said I'd be a fool not to reach out." Naomi remained silent initially, not due to nerves, as she wasn't feeling them. She was simply uncertain if it was genuine. "I want to offer you something," he continued. "It's not a job, yet, but it's a mentorship, one that could develop into something further. There's a summer program designed for young, creative thinkers. We want you to be a part of it." She discovered her ability to speak up. "But I haven't started college yet. I haven't even finished high school." He chuckled. "That's not important. We're not seeking degrees. We're looking for minds capable of sparking change." Naomi looked at her notes. The same ones she'd used in court, now spread across her desk like discarded awards. "I'm intrigued," she said. "Excellent," Brewster replied. "Please send me a copy of that argument." Following the call, Naomi remained still for an extended period. She didn't move or smile, simply taking everything in. A change had occurred. The courtroom proceedings were over. However, her personal journey, that unconventional path she had constructed independently, using library books and YouTube lectures, was no longer hidden. Her mom entered the room. "Are you hungry?" she inquired. Naomi nodded, feeling ravenous. Sitting opposite each other at the small kitchen table, her mom inquired, "Do you truly desire to pursue this? Law? Seriously?" Naomi ate her sandwich deliberately, then responded, "Yes. I believe I already am." Her mom offered a look, a drawn-out, probing expression unique to mothers, and then nodded once. Following this, she stated, "Then you better continue demonstrating your capabilities." That evening, Naomi remained up reading, driven not by obligation, but by a sense of purpose. Analyzing legal precedent felt less like an assignment and more like a language she was finally proficient in. The following morning, she received another call, this time from a high school student from 2 towns over. "Hey," the girl said, "I saw what you did. My brother's case is similar. I don't know where to begin. Could I ask you a question?" And with that, Naomi evolved into something more, not just a bright student, not just a relative advocating for family. She stood as an illustration, a demonstration that excellence doesn't await authorization, and fairness doesn't demand a position, but only truth, clarity, and the courage to speak. She didn't require a law degree to impact a courtroom. She simply needed an opportunity. And when she received it, she ensured no one would ever perceive her identically again. Your voice doesn't need a platform. It merely needs to be heard. If Naomi's story resonated with you, ensure you subscribe and share this video with someone who needs to be reminded. The key isn't the origin, but the level of dedication you demonstrate. Two adult men were laughing at a young woman attempting to work out. The gym was full, but no one intervened. That is until Terrence spoke up and caused everyone to stop ignoring the situation. The familiar scent of sweat and rubber filled the air. Dumbbells made a clunking sound, treadmills vibrated, and a few early gym-goers strained through their exercises with headphones on. It was a little after 7 a.m. at Ironworks Fitness in Knoxville, Tennessee. A typical Tuesday for many, but for Terrence Roy, it was leg day. Leg day held a special significance. He was finishing up wiping down the leg press when he noticed her. She appeared to be no older than 25. She had a tall, athletic build, her hair pulled back, and looked slightly out of place as if it were her first week at that gym. She lingered near the squat rack, clearly attempting to adjust the bar. This wasn't uncommon. Everyone begins somewhere. However, he then observed something else. Two men, likely in their mid to late 30s, white, wearing compression shirts that seemed unnecessary and displaying an unwarranted confidence. They were not exercising. They simply stood, resting on the preacher curl bench, observing her. Initially, the sounds were quiet, hushed whispers and slight chuckles. Then, one of them spoke, his voice carrying enough for many in the gym to hear. "Hey, sweetheart, that bar's heavier than you. Are you certain you don't need assistance?" The other responded with a loud, distinct laugh. She likely saw it on TikTok and believed she could simply enter and lift as a professional. Terrence paused, towel still in hand. His body tightened. He recognized that tone, sarcastic, yet with an underlying negativity. A combination of mockery and a sense of privilege. The kind that diminishes you without physical confrontation. The woman remained silent, continuously adjusting the bar, her gaze fixed forward. A subtle tremor ran through her hands. She inhaled deeply, as if suppressing something. Terrence surveyed the room. Approximately 15 people were present. Some had overheard something. He observed this by their reactions. A man wearing a red hoodie glanced at his phone, feigning disinterest. A woman near the ellipticals seemed uneasy, but remained silent. There was no movement, no vocalization. He settled onto a nearby bench, observing for a moment longer. Then, the realization struck him. This was bigger than just those two individuals and their inappropriate remarks. It concerned everyone present, including him, as they observed the event unfold and remained silent. Such incidents hadn't been uncommon in a location like this before. However, it may have been the first instance he found impossible to overlook. He rose deliberately, secured his water bottle, and approached. "Hey," he stated, his voice composed yet resolute. The two men turned. One displayed a smirk. "Talking to us?" The taller one questioned, raising his eyebrows. Terrence affirmed. "Do you find it amusing to harass someone while she's attempting to train?" The shorter one shrugged. "Relax, man. We were just joking," he said. "She didn't laugh," Terrence said, shifting his gaze towards the woman. She shook her head, softly. Several heads now turned. A man pausing between sets looked up. A staff member behind the counter moved closer, listening. The taller man folded his arms. "Your father or something?" he asked. "No, just someone who's tired of people thinking this kind of thing is acceptable." A silence descended, thick and tense, yet he remained still. "Look, man," the shorter one began, his earlier confidence diminished. "We didn't intend any harm." Terrence acknowledged, "Yeah, that's the issue," but the room remained unresponsive. He sensed an underlying tension, a peculiar quietness born of people feigning ignorance of what they had clearly heard. A palpable tension filled the room, as if everyone was holding their breath, anticipating how much further it would escalate before someone intervened. That's the feeling at Ironworks. Terrence remained still, and so did the two men. The taller man, identified as Kyle by his bright blue gym badge, still wore a tight smirk, though his arms were now folded across his chest, a less overtly confident posture. The shorter man, Bryce, had taken a step back, as if uncertain if a confrontation was imminent. Terrence was not present to engage in a physical altercation. He didn't need to. His mere presence conveyed authority. And for a man like him, 40 years old, with 2 children and 2 decades of maintaining composure in tense situations, he had learned that sometimes remaining still could be the most impactful action. But he also observed something else. Still, few people intervened. Some glanced up, then looked back down as if they had mistakenly chosen the wrong performance and wished to change channels. Others appeared uneasy, seemingly hoping he would cease and move on, and it stung him. Not because he anticipated assistance, but because he understood how readily people could retreat behind their earbuds or phone screens when situations became complex. One man, likely in his mid-50s, sat on a bench pressing dumbbells. He shook his head, not at Kyle or Bryce, but at Terrence, as if he were the issue, as if speaking out was more troubling than the inappropriate comments being made initially. The young woman, who had been silent, now sat on the edge of the squat rack platform, pretending to tie her shoe, even though it was already secure. It was a way to keep occupied, a way to avoid looking at anyone. She wished she wasn't involved in this situation, but she already was. Terrence took a deliberate breath. He angled himself, just enough so his voice would reach everyone. You all heard what they said, and you observed how she reacted. He spoke, not yelling, but ensuring his voice carried throughout the room. If someone addressed your sister, your daughter, your friend in that manner, would you remain silent? Still, no response. Kyle appeared to be about to speak, as if he had a clever retort prepared. However, only a tense jaw and narrowed eyes were visible. Bryce moved again. Listen, man, nobody intends to provoke a conflict here. Terrence nodded, seeming to reconsider. Lauren, the gym manager, who was in her mid-30s with a blonde ponytail and a name tag, approached from behind the front desk. She moved deliberately, appearing somewhat apprehensive. It seemed she anticipated complaints and was carefully assessing the situation. Is everything okay here? She inquired, her gaze shifting between the men. Terrence responded, just clearing something up. Kyle interjected, this dude thinks he can tell us what to say to people now. Lauren observed him, then the woman who remained near the barbell. She understood, perhaps not immediately, but sufficiently. Well, she stated cautiously, we don't permit harassment here. If anyone feels disrespected, that is something we must address seriously. Bryce laughed dismissively. Harassment? He remarked. We said one thing, he added. Terrence interjected. That was enough. A silence followed. Then, Lauren slowly turned toward the young woman. Are you all right? She inquired. The woman rose, silent but composed. She stated she was only here to exercise. Lauren affirmed, understood. You are welcome here. Please inform us if you encounter any further issues. And that concluded the interaction. The atmosphere didn't ease with a significant event. There was no altercation, no theatrical display, no commendation. However, a change occurred. Bryce and Kyle shared a glance. Subsequently, without further conversation, they departed toward the locker room, speaking quietly to themselves. No one intervened. It wasn't necessary. Terrence turned and made eye contact with the woman. She offered him a slight nod, a gesture of thanks without speaking. More impactful than the interaction itself was the stillness, the expressions, and the way others seemed to shrink in that instant. He repeatedly considered what the outcome would have been if he hadn't been present. However, the day continued, and the narrative began to spread beyond the gym. Terrence was in the process of filling his water bottle at the fountain when he detected a voice coming from behind him. A sense of triumph seemed to fill him. He didn't turn around immediately. He recognized the voice. It was Kyle, that familiar mocking tone, now without a crowd, sounding less assertive, more intimate. Terrence quietly replaced the cap on his bottle before turning to face him. Kyle stood alone, his arms hanging loosely, the sharpness in his features softened, replaced by what appeared to be wounded pride. Perhaps embarrassment, maybe simply the annoyance of not having the final say. I'm not here to be a hero, Terrence stated. I came here to exercise, just like everyone else. Kyle moved nearer. You reacted excessively over a minor incident. She hadn't expressed any concerns. You intervened as if she required assistance. Terrence subtly supported himself against the wall, maintaining his composure. She didn't need rescuing, but she shouldn't have been ridiculed either. You deliberately made her feel uneasy. Kyle made a dismissive sound. So now you're the guardian of feelings. Terrence inclined his head. It was simply a grown man weary of witnessing individuals feigning acceptance of public displays of erratic behavior. Kyle's jaw tightened. You don't know me, and you don't know her, Terrence responded. But that didn't prevent him from speaking. There was a pause, a genuine one, where Kyle remained motionless, blinking, as if a portion of him wasn't accustomed to anyone challenging without shouting or striking. Just statements, simply a reflection. Then Kyle surveyed his surroundings. The hallway adjacent to the locker rooms was silent. Just them and the low hum of a treadmill belt nearby. You people always got to make it racial, he muttered. Terrence felt it. That shift, that old tired line, meant to flip the blame, meant to derail. He kept his voice steady. You brought race into it when you thought she was an easy target. You thought nobody would say anything. That's not on me. Kyle didn't answer. I've been in places like this all my life, Terrence went on, and I know when something's just a joke. When a situation arose involving asserting dominance, Terrence remained silent. Then Kyle exhaled sharply and mumbled, whatever, man. As he turned towards the locker room, Terrence observed him leave, then subtly shook his head. It wasn't a reaction of anger, nor of triumph, but of understanding. He had no desire to cause humiliation. He didn't require a public victory. The crucial aspect was that he had been heard, that Kyle, even if unwilling to acknowledge it, recognized it. And at that moment, a voice spoke behind him, quieter this time. It was the young woman. She had changed her shirt, with her hoodie pulled halfway over her head. Thank you, she said, her voice almost a whisper for saying something. Terrence gave a small smile. You're welcome. I didn't know what to do, she added. I just froze. That's okay, he said. You don't owe anyone a reaction. That's the thing nobody tells you. Sometimes just making it through moments like that is enough. She nodded. I'm Janelle, she said to Terrence. They shook hands. Do you come here often? She inquired, with a slight amusement at how predictable it seemed. 3 times a week, he stated, in the morning before work. She responded with a smile. It appears I will begin arriving early as well. Then, she proceeded towards the exit. There were no tears, no dramatic display of emotion. Simply a moment of quiet understanding between 2 individuals who now had a shared experience. However, as that phase concluded, another development had already begun to unfold beyond the gym's confines. By the time Terrence arrived home that evening, the children were already partially through dinner. Sonia, his wife, balanced a laptop on her knee while guiding their youngest through spelling homework, as was typical for a weekday. It reminded him that everyday life continues regardless of significant events that occurred earlier. However, the burden persisted as he entered. He attempted to shed it at the gym, to release it while driving. But such experiences don't always remain where they originate. They travel with you, subtly. How was the gym? Sonia inquired while serving mashed potatoes for their son, Caleb. Terrence paused. It was peculiar, actually, that prompted her to look up, her eyebrows raised. He recounted everything to her. He presented only the facts, without embellishment or exaggeration. What Kyle and Bryce had said, how no one intervened initially, and how he ultimately did. He described Janelle's reaction, the discomfort, and the ensuing silence. Sonia listened intently, chewing deliberately and maintaining eye contact. Upon his completion, she leaned back and released a breath through her nose. It's the typical situation, she remarked, not dismissively, but with a weary tone, a recognizable tiredness. I understand, Terrence responded. However, something about today felt different. Do you mean the fact that you were the sole person to comment? She inquired. Yes, that, and he hesitated. I observed how many people listened and remained silent. Because that's often the way things unfold, she stated, rising to rinse a plate. People avoid involvement. They desire to prevent uncomfortable moments. They're apprehensive about speaking up and becoming entangled. Some believe it's not their concern. He nodded slowly. It shouldn't be typical, he thought. It shouldn't, she replied in agreement. However, It was later that night, after the children were asleep and the house was still, when Terrence checked his phone. Alerts appeared from a local Facebook group he followed, Knoxville Fit Life Community. A post detailed the event. Saw something crazy at Ironworks today. A man stood up for a woman being teased by two guys at the squat rack. There was no violence, just a direct challenge, which is commendable. The post already had over 100 comments. Some users expressed praise for the individual. Others inquired about the situation. A few responded with predictable reactions. The complete details are unknown. It seems people are easily offended these days. Humor is no longer tolerated. Terrence did not participate in the discussion. He simply observed it unfold. A short clip was even posted, a shaky, 3-second phone video showing him standing in front of Kyle and Bryce, his back to the camera. A still image depicts a man steadfastly remaining in place. He felt uncomfortable being the focus of attention, not due to shame, but because it diverted focus from the core message. The intention was for the discussion to highlight how easily inappropriate actions can go unnoticed if no one speaks up. The following morning at the gym, the atmosphere had shifted. Janelle was present again. This time, she offered him a fist bump, her face displaying a friendly smile as if they had been gym companions for years. People observed without negativity. Several individuals nodded in his direction, a gesture of understanding rather than attention-seeking. Lauren, the gym manager, approached him discreetly once he concluded a set. "Hey," she began, "thank you again for yesterday." He turned to face her. "We're experienced previous difficulties," she explained, with people voicing sentiments they perceive as benign. "This time, discussions are occurring about it. Perhaps it will bring about a change. Maybe," he responded. Just as he reached for his towel, a man from the back, appearing to be in his mid-60s, with a wiry build and gray in his beard, approached. "I was here yesterday," he stated. Terrence raised an eyebrow. "Yes," the man confirmed. He paused, then added, "I didn't say anything then. Should have. I have 2 granddaughters. I often think if that were one of them, I want someone like you close by." Terrence remained silent for a moment. Then the man offered a half smile and said, "Appreciate that. My name's Roland. If you ever need a place to stay, I'm around." Terrence hadn't anticipated who would enter next, and the words he would speak. Terrence hadn't expected anyone in particular when the gym doors opened late that Friday afternoon. But there he was, Bryce. No Kaidi, no Savagir, no Zmirk. Just a man walking in with headphones around his neck and something in his eyes that hadn't been there previously. Terrence noticed him the moment he entered. He was uncertain whether Bryce would disregard him, attempt a confrontation, or act as if the previous day hadn't occurred. However, Bryce did not feign indifference. Instead, he approached Terrence directly after he completed his warm-up set on the lat pull-down machine. "Hey," he said, his voice softer than it had been previously. "Do you have a minute?" Terrence hesitated before responding. He maintained his grip on the machine's handle, carefully observing Bryce's expression for any indication of mockery. He detected none. "All right," Terrence finally said. Bryce shifted his weight, restless. "I spoke with Kyle," he started. "He believes you intentionally embarrassed us. He's still upset, but—" Terrence remained silent. "I have 2 sons," Bryce continued, aged 10 and 8. "They were at the park recently. I observe an older boy teasing them. Nothing serious, just provoking them. And I understood. I felt paralyzed. I didn't know how to react. I simply watched." He hesitated. "I recalled my silence during that incident with the girl. We were certainly behaving poorly, and Terrence observed it." "Now what?" "You were right," Bryce stated, his gaze unwavering. "I don't want to be that person, not for my children and not for my own sake." Terrence shifted back a little. "It's not about being correct. It's about recognizing when to cease being the individual you'd avoid encountering." Bryce affirmed. They stood in silence for a moment. Just 2 men in gym clothes, under fluorescent lights, speaking as if the conversation held significance. "I'm not going to apologize for Kyle," Bryce stated. "He's got his own things to sort out. But I do apologize for my words, for my behavior." Terrence extended his hand. "I accept that," they said, shaking hands firmly, briefly, genuinely. Later that evening, Terrence sat on the porch with his daughter, Elise, who just turned 14 and had recently taken an interest in running. She inquired about what occurred at the gym. She remembered hearing her mom briefly mention something earlier. He paused, then recounted the events. He presented the information directly, without minimizing its impact. He described the conversation, the quiet moments, the disagreement, and the subsequent apology. He observed her reaction as he spoke, noting the shifts in her expression with each detail. "So you simply spoke with them?" She questioned, lifting her eyebrows. "Yes," he replied. "I didn't raise my voice. I didn't create a disturbance. I simply asked them why they believed that type of conduct was acceptable. Did that have an effect? It didn't produce immediate changes, but perhaps it prompted reflection. That's frequently how shifts begin." Elise glanced at her sneakers, fiddling with the laces. "I'm not sure I would have the courage to say something like that," she whispered. Terrence smiled. "The interesting aspect is you don't feel courageous when you do it. You simply feel that someone needs to." She looked up at him, her eyes gentle, yet containing something else now. "Perhaps pride." "I will try," she said softly. "You don't need to do anything special," he responded. "Just pay attention. When something doesn't feel right, don't ignore it. Speak up if you can, or be there for someone who can't." They sat in silence for a while afterward. There was no need to fill the space, just the kind of silence that felt substantial instead of vacant. But Monday was approaching, and someone unexpected still had something to say before this story would feel complete. Monday morning began as any other. Terrence parked his usual spot, swiped his gym card at the front desk, and proceeded to the free weights. He anticipated a routine start to the week, nothing out of the ordinary. Then he noticed him. Roland, the older man who had spoken to him a few days prior, was positioned by the dumbbell rack, stretching his shoulders as if preparing for an extensive set. However, today he wasn't in workout clothes. He wore jeans, boots, and a dark jacket zipped up halfway. He wasn't here to train. He was waiting. "Got a minute?" Roland inquired, glancing up as Terrence neared. Terrence affirmed, and they walked towards the small lounge area near the vending machines. The gym was still, and few noticed them. Roland clasped his hands together, appearing hesitant. "I've been considering what occurred," he finally stated. "What you did, what you said." Terrence remained silent. Roland added, "I'm 66. I've witnessed a great deal in my years. I spent my childhood in Ohio during the 60s. My father owned a tire shop. We weren't wealthy, but we managed. I recall the time the schools integrated. I remember the underlying stress. However, we never discussed it at home." He paused. "And because of that lack of discussion, I felt unprepared when difficult situations arose. I would witness events, both at work and around town, and would tell myself, well, that's not my concern, believing silence equated to neutrality. It became clear later that it was not the case." Terrence listened, remaining silent. Roland's voice lowered a little. "The day you spoke to those men, I was present. I was 2 benches away. I heard everything." Terrence nodded slowly, "And I assumed you noticed. I felt compelled to intervene. I truly did, but I couldn't speak. I remained motionless." He reacted with a shake of his head, and I'm still regretting it. Terrence moved closer. "You are here now. That has value." Roland exhaled. "I have grandchildren, 2 girls and 1 boy. The girls are of mixed heritage. My daughter married a black man, a good guy who teaches 6th grade. I often think about them. If they had been in that gym and someone had spoken to them in that manner, I would want someone like Terrence present, someone who wouldn't remain silent." The room felt different now, not negatively, simply more substantial. "I've expressed sentiments in the past that I regret," Roland admitted. "I've allowed certain things to go unaddressed that I shouldn't have, but I am striving to improve. That's why I came today, to offer my gratitude, and to assure you that I will speak up in the future." No more hesitation. Terrence finally smiled. That meant more than you probably realize. They shook hands again. This one felt different. Not a gesture of thanks, but a recognition of a new understanding. "I might even start working out again," Roland added with a chuckle. Terrence grinned. "Start with light weights. Don't go breaking something." They both laughed, and the tension in the air finally eased. Following Roland's departure, Terrence stood near the mirror wall, a towel draped over his shoulder, and observed the room for a brief moment. It was the same gym with the same walls. Yet, it felt altered, not due to any sudden improvement in everyone's abilities, nor because of the eradication of racism, but because of a subtle change. One person spoke, another listened, a third reconsidered their perspective. It wasn't a complete transformation, but it represented a difference. And sometimes, a small difference is enough to initiate progress. Even with everything, the true understanding didn't come until Terrence saw what his daughter posted later that night. It was approximately 9:30 when Terrence finally sat down on the edge of his bed. Shoes kicked off, lights dimmed, the soft hum of the hallway fan in the background. Sonia was reading, legs curled under the blanket, her glasses sliding down her nose. He grabbed his phone to check a few messages before bed, and that's when he saw a new post from Elise. He clicked. It was a selfie. An ordinary picture, her hair pulled back, no filter, wearing her school hoodie. But it was the caption that stopped him. My dad stood up for a stranger this week. He didn't yell, he didn't throw hands, he just spoke up. And that was enough to make people think, including me. I used to believe keeping quiet made you neutral, but I was wrong. Silence has side. I hope I'm brave like him when it matters. Terrence stared at the screen, not because he was surprised by the message, but because it was so confident and direct. It had come from his teenage daughter, the one who used to feel anxious requesting ketchup from a server, the one who once cried when she had to recite a poem in front of her class. And now she was sharing words like that publicly. He glanced at Sonia and gave her the phone. She read it quietly, then smiled without looking up. You seem to notice she's observing your actions, don't you? Terrence sighed. I'm mostly just attempting to make it through the week. She responded, setting the phone down on the nightstand. You're managing better than that. He reclined, gazing at the ceiling, allowing the feeling to linger. Everything that transpired in the last few days, Kyle, Bryce, Janelle, Roland, Elise, all began with a single choice. Not a significant one, not a sensational one. Simply a decision to speak instead of remaining silent. That was all. That recollection remained with him profoundly. People often assume that taking a stand requires fearlessness, but that isn't the reality. Frequently, one experiences fear and doubt. There's a reluctance to create awkwardness. Yet, remaining silent has consequences for others. He recalled Janelle's expression when she described feeling paralyzed. He remembered Roland's nervous habit of rubbing his hands together as he confessed his uncertainty about what to do. He recalled Bryce struggling to express regret without appearing vulnerable. And he mused, this is the beginning. Not with elaborate pronouncements, not with online condemnation, but in tangible locations with genuine individuals who opt for the somewhat more challenging course of action. The subsequent morning, Terrence paused in his vehicle within the gym parking lot prior to entering, not to prepare himself, simply to contemplate. Afterward, he retrieved his phone and composed a message. It wasn't intended for widespread dissemination. The goal wasn't validation, it was simply sharing a truth. Significant impact doesn't require a grand gesture. It involves acknowledging injustice and speaking out, regardless of fear or isolation. That's where progress begins. He published the message and exited the vehicle. It was another Monday, another workout, but with a feeling of lightness he hadn't experienced previously. Many people have experienced moments similar to those described. If you've hesitated in the past, remember you have future opportunities. The important consideration is, in those future instances, how will you respond? Speak out, even when it causes discomfort, even if the matter seems minor. Because remaining silent may preserve your ease, but it won't safeguard another's dignity. And someone close to you may be awaiting a voice such as yours. Should this story have struck a chord, please share it and leave a comment. Don't forget to subscribe, as we have additional stories exploring the true meaning of doing what's right. He entered the bank, his appearance marked by a tattered coat and old shoes. People assumed he was simply another person experiencing homelessness. Then, he spoke calmly, stating, I own the land this building sits on, and presented documentation to support his claim. The door's chimes sounded as it always did upon entry, yet few people acknowledged it. They barely glanced up. A few fleeting looks were all it received. One woman subtly shifted her position to observe him before returning to her computer screen. Another took a sip of her coffee and rolled her eyes, murmuring something to the teller beside her. A man entering the space appeared out of sync with the surroundings, not threatening, simply different. The environment consisted of shiny glass, polished tile, and Bluetooth headsets visible behind the counters. This was Morris Coltrane Langston, age 62, with a thick gray beard. His coat was 2 sizes too large, and his jeans suggested a past no one wished to explore. He moved deliberately, not due to age, but with caution. Each step felt significant, as if he were assessing his place within the setting. He approached the counter where Brittany was working. She offered him a brief look. "Sir, a bank card or ID is required for withdrawals," she stated plainly. Morris offered a gentle smile, though it seemed weary. "I don't require a withdrawal. I need to discuss property," he said. Brittany's eyes widened slightly. She glanced at her colleague, who was visibly trying to contain laughter. "Property?" she asked. "Yes," he confirmed. "I believe I own the land this bank is built on." At that moment, the laughter erupted. The message originated from Cliff Yarrow, the assistant branch manager, who had approached, arms crossed. Cliff was a man who displayed his authority prominently. He made no attempt to conceal his amusement. "Sir, I believe you are at the incorrect building," Cliff stated. "This is not the county records office. You cannot simply enter and declare ownership of a bank." "I did not say I own the bank," Maurice responded, his voice quiet. "I said I own the land. There's a distinction." Now, all eyes were upon him. The security guard, identified as Lee, who typically appeared to be checking his phone near the door, stood up straighter and moved forward. Cliff questioned, "Do you have any paperwork to back that up?" Maurice slowly reached into his coat pocket. For a moment, Lee reacted, conditioned by experience to anticipate a potential threat when a black man reached into a pocket. However, Morris's movements were unhurried and non-threatening. He carried the envelope deliberately, as if accustomed to it. He produced a thick, crumpled packet. The pages were yellowed with worn edges, having been folded and unfolded numerous times. At the top, it read, "Franklin Delroy, 1913 land deed." Below that were stamped legal seals and notary signatures. "I've held on to this since my father passed," I said. "And he kept it since his father passed," Maurice added. The deed belonged to a black-owned cooperative that obtained plots throughout this section of Knoxville during the Reconstruction era. I tapped the envelope gently. "This confirms my grandfather did not sell the land. It was leased. Ownership returned to us following a default, though this information was never shared." Brittany's smirk disappeared. Lee stopped scrolling. Cliff cleared his throat. "I believe it's time for you to leave, sir," he stated. "I think it's time someone examines the contents," Maurice said calmly. Then, an unexpected event occurred. A man from the office furthest to the left, John Delgado, the branch manager, emerged. He had been observing through the glass for the preceding few minutes. He requested the documents. Morris provided them immediately. John escorted them back to his office. A period of silence followed, lasting briefly. Subsequently, 5 minutes elapsed, then 10. Eventually, John appeared. His expression was altered. "Connect me with regional compliance on the line." Immediately, he stated. As phones began to ring and conversations grew concerned, Maurice remained still at his position by the counter. He was anticipating something, and they all understood, instinctively, that it wasn't a monetary request. Cliff walked back and forth behind the teller row, massaging the back of his neck, as if that would aid his comprehension of what he's heard. John Delgado continued on the phone, speaking in brief, strained sentences to someone at corporate. His office blinds were partially closed, but every few seconds, a glimpse of his face emerged from the gap. He wasn't smiling anymore. Brittany stood uncomfortably at her station, looking sideways at Maurice, who hadn't moved from his position. His hands were folded, and documents rested gently on the counter in front of him. "Do you want to sit down?" she finally asked, her voice softer. Maurice shook his head. "I've done enough sitting in my life." A man in a tailored suit and thick-rimmed glasses walked in briskly from a back entrance. His ID badge read Gerald Tisdale, Regional Property and Compliance. He went straight to Delgado's office without a word. Moments later, John opened the door again and waved for Maurice. "Sir, would you mind stepping in for a moment?" Maurice nodded once and retrieved his envelope. His boots made a slight scuffing sound against the tile as he entered the office. As the door closed behind him, the remaining staff members quieted. No one spoke. Even the security guard adjusted his position, uncertain whether to remain nearby or act as if nothing was occurring. Inside, the atmosphere was tense. "Mr. Langston," Gerald stated cautiously, "I've reviewed the original deed and the tax history you provided. Could you please tell us where you've been keeping these documents?" "My father kept it in a box of his belongings," Maurice responded. "He was a carpenter, building houses in Alcoa and Maryville before his knees failed. After he passed away, I kept the papers in a locker at a storage unit I used when I lacked permanent housing." Delgado appeared astonished. "You're saying this land was never sold? That the trust was still active?" Maurice retrieved a smaller, more recent envelope and gave it to Gerald. Inside was a typed letter from a small firm in Chattanooga, a probate specialist named Lena Fry, confirming the lapse in city filings and the reversion clause in the original agreement. The letter was dated 6 months ago. I only found it after she assisted me in reviewing some of my dad's old files. "Thought it was junk at first," Gerald said, staring at the paper. His mouth opened a little, but he didn't speak. "Legally," Maurice explained, "this building stood on land that was part of my grandfather's estate. The lease agreement had been temporary. As the bank underwent mergers and changes in ownership over the years, the arrangement wasn't renewed. They simply built on the land, presuming no one would inquire." Delgado rubbed his temple. "That represented decades of transactions," Maurice stated, "and not a single one examined the records far enough back. Everyone seemed to think the past had resolved itself." Gerald rose quickly and gazed out the office window. "We need to involve legal right away," he stated. "Already done," John responded quietly. A voice drifted from outside the office, speaking too loudly. Why would a homeless man return for this now? What would he possibly do with a piece of land beneath a bank? Inside, Maurice noticed. He glanced towards the window, then resumed looking at Gerald. "I didn't come for money," he said. "I came seeking the truth, and perhaps a measure of respect." Gerald turned, finally meeting my eyes. There was a pause. "You are not wrong, but while discussions focused on compliance and liability, something else was unfolding in the lobby. Whispers had escalated to murmurs, and one employee was already texting someone outside the bank. The story, as it turns out, began long before Maurice ever entered that bank. Prior to the advent of smartphones, before suburban expansion consumed agricultural land, before the concept of a man like Maurice could be envisioned, standing serenely with a document, contesting the very core of a multi-million-dollar organization. In 1913, Franklin Delroy, Morris's grandfather, was 23 years old and already recognized within Blount County for his skilled workmanship. His hands constructed churches, schoolhouses, and porches that remained standing a century later. Unbeknownst to many, Franklin was also a member of a discreet, close-knit group of black tradesmen, farmers, and ministers who combined their resources to purchase land. The purpose wasn't financial gain, but a matter of dignity. They identified as the East Bluntland Cooperative, and throughout the years, they obtained small plots on the periphery of what was then essentially cow pasture. However, Franklin, ever the visionary, included a specific provision in his deed. Should the land ever undergo development, leasing, or a claim by another party without a sale, ownership would return to his descendants after a specified duration. In 1927, a lumber company made a payment to lease the land for a limited time. Subsequently, a warehouse was constructed, followed by a small credit union. By the 1970s, that credit union had transformed into a regional bank. And when it was acquired again in 2003, all of the original documents were misplaced, overlooked, or lost within the new ownership. The Delroy family was never notified. Franklin was gone by that point. Morris's father, Jasper Langston, attempted to preserve the family's history. However, circumstances grew difficult. Employment opportunities disappeared, and Jasper began drinking. The traditional stories evolved into mere bedtime stories, losing any sense of verifiable truth. Morris recalled sitting on the porch in his youth, listening to his dad describe the plot by the rail tracks that Granddaddy owned. Yet, it held little significance for him. The stories remained just that, stories, until he matured and understood how families like his were frequently excluded from their own history. In 2020, when COVID caused widespread closures and Morris was residing in a church basement in Sevierville, he finally sorted through the last of his father's possessions. Among them, he discovered the original deed carefully wrapped in wax paper, and within it, a small note written in his dad's handwriting. "If you find this, don't let him tell you we didn't leave anything behind." Morris took that note with great importance. He dedicated months to research at the public library. He made trips to the county clerk's office. He consulted with Lena Fry, the probate attorney who remained professional when he shared the story with her. She located the land records and carefully compared parcel numbers, and she verified his findings. The land, now valued at millions, had been leased, not sold. The original clause remained in effect. No legal purchase had ever occurred. Consequently, after years of homelessness, this situation seems quite unusual. Morris entered the building constructed upon his grandfather's land and stated something unexpected. "I believe this belongs to me." At the bank, John Delgado now had the documents spread across his desk. They contained a century's worth of signatures, carbon copies, and ink stamps from courthouses that no longer existed. Gerald, the regional compliance officer, examined one page as if it had committed a personal offense. According to this clause, he stated, "The property returns to the original family if the lease expires without renewal or sale." John confirmed this had occurred twice, and the family was not notified. "That's correct." A significant silence followed. Then Gerald quietly expressed concern, saying, "We're in trouble." Maurice remained seated opposite them, silent. He showed no sign of a smile. However, a sense of calm was evident on his face. It was as if a man had, at long last, joined together all the pieces of a puzzle and possessed the perseverance to complete it. As events aligned within that office, a woman on her lunch break began live streaming the growing disturbance outside the bank. The unfolding situation quickly transcended their internal narrative. The lobby's ambience underwent a change. Initial silent assessment evolved into quiet wonder. The atmosphere then became something different altogether, a palpable sense of nervous anticipation. A teller had moved away from her workspace and was positioned by the coffee machine, appearing to stir sugar while observing the office door as if expecting someone to enter. The security guard had repositioned himself, now standing nearer to Morris's chair, seemingly not for protection, but perhaps to observe. Beyond the glass partitions, John Delgado's office was full. Gerald Tisdale was participating in a video conference with a group of legal representatives from corporate, their faces difficult to interpret. A senior counsel, Mark Levin, repeatedly posed the same inquiry. How did this oversight occur? No one could provide a satisfactory explanation. The numerous transfers of ownership involving various parent companies and banks had obscured the documentation until Morris brought it back to their attention. "There's a public title gap," Gerald stated. "No signed release, no recorded sale." The reversion clause was never satisfied. Mark Levin moved closer to the screen. "Does this man, Langston, possess the original documents?" John stated that he has more than just documents. He has lineage, and we verified the parcel data. It's the same land. The only alterations were the asphalt and steel constructed upon it. Mark pinched his nose. "Okay, here's what we need. Secure a release from this man. Offer a small settlement. Remove him from the building before the press arrives." Maurice, seated quietly nearby, understood their thinking without needing to hear the discussion. He understood the atmosphere. After decades of observing how people assess your value, John ended the call and turned to him. "Mr. Langston, would you be willing to settle this today? We could quietly arrange compensation, something equitable." Morris folded his arms. "What's fair to you?" John paused. That would require negotiation. But if we act quickly, we could avoid unwanted publicity. Maurice chuckled softly. Unwanted by whom? John momentarily looked surprised. A knock sounded at the glass door. A woman, identifiable by the local news logo on her lanyard, smiled and raised her phone. Hello. We've received information that someone entered with a land deed asserting ownership of the bank property. May we speak with Mr. Langston? John's face visibly drained. Who informed you? A voice from the lobby murmured. The live streams have exceeded 12,000 viewers. Morris rose to his feet deliberately. There's nothing to be concerned about. I'm not intending to cause a disturbance. Gerald approached. Mr. Langston, please understand that this situation requires careful handling. It would benefit everyone involved if we could maintain discretion. I attempted a subtle approach, Maurice stated. I'm accustomed to quiet. It defined much of my existence. It yielded no progress. A pause settled over the group. Gerald seemed poised to object, but a palpable truth lingered, inescapable. Returning to the lobby, Brittany spoke softly to Maurice. The amusement had vanished from her face. Do you truly possess this? She inquired. I have always possessed it, he replied. The recollection seemed to simply vanish. She lowered her gaze, a hint of embarrassment visible. I'm sorry. Morris's expression eased a little. It's not your fault. You were instructed on how to behave when someone like me enters. The bank's doors opened once more, and 2 additional reporters entered. A man carried a boom microphone over his shoulder. Another began recording with his phone. Cliff attempted to block their entry. This is private property. A reporter responded, observing Maurice. Not for long. As inquiries began from the media, Maurice did not seek attention. He instead glanced back at the familiar envelope he held, the one that held his family's history across generations, and understood it was time for the world to know it. Maurice needed no microphone. He needed no formal announcement. He simply needed to remain where he was. That was sufficient. A reporter, a woman in her 40s named Kimber Rowland from WBR, approached. Mr. Langston, could you verify that you assert ownership of the land the bank occupies? Maurice met her gaze, unwavering. I'm not asserting anything, he stated. I'm presenting facts, and the document in my hand demonstrates what none of you ever took the time to investigate. Kimber nodded thoughtfully, recognizing the significance in his tone. What outcome are you pursuing with this? Maurice didn't respond immediately. He turned to address the increasingly large gathering. There were customers, employees, and security present, with some people watching from the sidewalk. What I'm hoping for, he said finally, is that the next time someone walks in looking like I do, maybe people won't react with amusement first. The silence that followed was palpable. The young man who had been laughing earlier near the coffee machine suddenly looked down at his shoes. Brittany tightened her grip on her ID badge and avoided his gaze. Cliff shifted uncomfortably and cleared his throat. Look, sir, I didn't mean any disrespect. You need to comprehend. We simply weren't prepared. There was laughter. Maurice intervened. You all responded that way. The moment I entered the room, you observed my coat, my shoes, the discoloration on my hands, and you determined I was insignificant. No one spoke. Have you ever considered how many people you're likely to dismiss each day? Moving around here as if you possess all the knowledge. As if you've already assessed someone's narrative merely by viewing their exterior. John Delgado moved ahead, attempting to redirect the situation. Mr. Langston, we are ready to offer a formal apology and begin settlement negotiations. Maurice gave him a drawn-out, weary look. Do you still believe this concerns finances? A teenager with a camera phone murmured to his friend, out of view of the reporters, Dude, this person is really committed. Observe the documents. Kimber, perceiving something more significant, inquired, Where have you been until now? What prompted you to come forward at this time? Maurice sighed, not in annoyance, simply in contemplation. Following my dad's passing, I lost interest in matters of this nature. I was preoccupied with basic survival, taking on sporadic jobs like roofing, welding, and janitorial work whenever available. Maintaining stable housing proved difficult when people avoided direct interaction. I experienced periods of both prosperity and hardship, followed by even more challenging times. He paused, There were nights I slept under bridges and mornings I cleaned the same floors people used to ignore me. However, I never discarded that envelope. The memory of every shelter I stayed in, every town I passed through, remained with me. He held it up gently. It's all I had left from a man who believed we were worth more than people thought. And one day, I simply grew weary of silence. A woman from the crowd spoke softly. You kept the deed all these years? Maurice nodded. 50 years it stayed in our family. Passed from one calloused hand to another, Kimber asked. And what now? He surveyed the bank lobby, his gaze lingering on each employee who had assessed him that morning. What now? He repeated. Now you recall my name. From a corner location, Gerald spoke to John. This is going to be a public relations disaster. However, the individuals within the bank weren't observing Gerald, they were observing Maurice. Truly observing. Some for the first time, as if a barrier had been removed. Not just from his narrative, but from theirs as well. You believe I was unseen? Maurice stated softly. I remained present. You simply didn't observe carefully enough. However, the outside world had already begun to notice. They perceived a man who brought more than just a deed to that building. He carried evidence that dignity isn't derived from affluence. It arises from steadfastly maintaining one's identity. By the following morning, the narrative had spread beyond state lines. Every local news station in Tennessee aired a rendition of it. Some reported inaccuracies. A report suggested Maurice had assumed control of the bank, a claim that proved false. Nevertheless, the message spread. Residents of Blount County, particularly older individuals, began searching through attics and storage boxes, questioning what they might have overlooked. College students shared excerpts online with accompanying text, such as this exemplifies generational theft. To them, Maurice wasn't a news item. He represented an alert and a sign. At the bank, the situation quickly worsened. Legal representatives from the corporation arrived from elsewhere. Security personnel were now joined by local police officers patrolling the parking lot, employed for crowd management. Demonstrators had assembled along the sidewalk, displaying cardboard signs. Their messages included phrases like respect land rights. Not just a deed, a legacy. He was right all along. Maurice hadn't organized the gathering, nor had he requested anyone to attend, yet they came. Inside the building, the atmosphere was tense. Gerald Tisdale was pacing once more, his face flushed as he managed calls from corporate and press liaisons. John Delgado was in his office, with the blinds completely shut, feeling the burden of everything. Maurice was in the break room, drinking coffee from paper cup. Never thought I'd be allowed in here, he remarked, mostly to himself. Kimber Rowland had returned, and her camera crew was filming quietly from the parking lot. She wasn't trying to create problems. She was simply waiting for the story to unfold. That afternoon, a legal representative, Clay Addison, entered the bank. He possessed a clean-shaven appearance, a southern drawl, and wore a silk tie that appeared more valuable than Morris's entire wardrobe. He did not offer a smile. Mr. Langston, Clay began, settling across from him, let me start by saying our firm recognizes the validity of your documentation. We are here to discuss terms. Maurice listened intently, remaining still. You placed our client in a complex situation. We acknowledge the oversight and are ready to present a substantial financial offer for the permanent transfer of ownership. A paper was slid across the table by Clay. Maurice looked at it, then raised his gaze. You believe this is the core issue? He inquired, his voice level. It's a considerable sum, Clay stated. It's a price, Maurice replied, and it doesn't come close to covering what you're attempting to resolve. Clay released a sharp breath. What would be acceptable to you? Maurice leaned forward, composed but resolute. I want a plaque with my grandfather's name displayed out front. I also want the official record corrected with the city, and I want a foundation established in his name, one that provides housing for families who have experienced similar circumstances. Clay blinked. Are you serious? I'm absolutely serious. There was a significant pause. Then Clay said, I will present this to the board. You please do that. Information about the negotiation became public the same day. And when it did, an unforeseen development occurred. People began making donations. People donated online, in person, and by check. One woman from Jackson traveled 2 hours to personally hand Maurice a $20 bill and express her gratitude for him, ensuring they weren't forgotten. The bank subsequently released a brief statement later that week, stating, "We recognize the validity of Mr. Maurice Langston's claim and are working in good faith to resolve this matter respectfully. We have deep appreciation for the legacy of Franklin Delroy and the community he helped build." While corporate and sanitized, this statement was unexpected. Regarding Maurice, there was no celebration. No press conference was held. He simply exited the bank one afternoon, carrying the same envelope he had entered with. However, this time he wasn't alone. 3 generations of Delroys stood with him in spirit, and hundreds more supported them. While legal teams assessed expenses and public relations teams prepared announcements, the most important aspect had already transpired. Someone like Maurice had finally been acknowledged, and the narrative was no longer controlled by the bank. It belonged to everyone who had ever been forgotten. The sun shone that morning. Maurice Langston stood in front of the bank again. Now, he wasn't standing on disputed land. He was standing on his grandfather's land, officially recognized by the city of Knoxville as part of the Franklin Delroy Legacy Trust. It wasn't just a name on paper anymore. A new plaque had been installed outside the bank's main entrance, embedded in a small brick pedestal near the sidewalk. Bronze letters, clear and lasting. Dedicated to Franklin Delroy, 1890 to 1954, builder, father, landowner. His legacy endures. Maurice touched it softly. The plaque felt cool beneath his fingertips. He remained silent. Words weren't necessary. A small group had assembled for the unveiling. Community leaders, students from the local university, reporters, and some of the same bank staff who previously ridiculed him were present. Brittany stood at the rear, her hands clasped, attempting to make eye contact with Maurice whenever he turned. This time he succeeded. The foundation he had proposed was already being established. A partnership with a local nonprofit was formed within weeks of the settlement. The Delroy Housing Fund would provide grants to families at risk of homelessness, particularly those who have been disadvantaged by legal complexities and overlooked actions. "I didn't desire revenge," Maurice told Kimber Rowland in his final interview. "I simply wanted the truth to endure beyond the falsehood." It had taken years to reach this point. For years, he had experienced being overlooked, marginalized, and disregarded. However, the instant he entered through those glass doors, holding a creased envelope and a legacy of suffering, things began to shift. And currently, he was simply a man identified by a name. He had acquired a modest, well-kept house not distant from the outskirts of Alcoa, close to the same areas where his father had previously constructed porches and fences. It wasn't elaborate, merely a neat area, a functional sink, a bed to relax in. Occasionally, he would sit on a plastic chair outside, sipping coffee and greeting children cycling up the slope. On other occasions, he collaborated with local high schools, discussing land ownership, family histories, and the consequences of oblivion with students. Preserve your documents, he advised them. Retain your names. Ensure no one erases your people from the narrative. People now referred to him as Mr. Langston. At times, even Sir, but the designation he valued most was the one his grandfather had attained. Builder. It wasn't about buildings, but about something larger. Legacy. He never anticipated forgiveness from the bank. However, it wasn't necessary. What he required, he received: an acknowledgement, a correction, and the opportunity for those who followed to declare, "I belong here too." The bank continued its operations, but the employees carried themselves differently. They engaged with people they had previously overlooked. They posed questions rather than making assumptions. The transformation wasn't flawless, but it represented a meaningful shift. One afternoon, several months following the resolution of events, Brittany approached him outside the community center. "Mr. Langston?" she asked, her voice betraying nervousness. "Yes," he replied. I've been taking night classes. Real estate law." He raised an eyebrow. "Is that so?" he inquired. "After everything that happened, I realized how much I didn't know. About ownership, history, how things get passed down or lost." Morris smiled. slow and genuine. Good for you. She paused. I'm sorry for how I treated you that first day. He nodded. An apology wasn't necessary. It was owed to the individual who would next enter. She considered this thoughtfully, responding, yes, I will. He retrieved a copy of the original deed, a replica, to be exact, from his coat and gave it to her. Keep this. Use it in class. Teach someone something. She accepted it with care, as if it were fragile. As she departed, Morris looked towards the street and observed a group of teenagers assembling at the bus stop across the road. One of them gestured towards the plaque. The others drew closer to listen. He remained silent, allowing them to continue. He simply observed, a quiet sense of pride welling up within him, as his grandfather's name emerged in the discussion once more. Perhaps that's how genuine transformation truly begins. Not through rage, nor solely through the pursuit of justice, but through remembrance and the bravery to keep it alive. Should you experience a feeling while hearing Morris's narrative, do not hold it back. Spread it. Discuss it. And if there's a family name you haven't mentioned in some time, vocalize it. The impact of legacies endures only when we actively preserve them. Subscribe for more stories that illuminate the true meaning of dignity.